Rain had been falling over the Olympic foothills since before dusk, a steady silver curtain that blurred the cedars and turned the yard beyond Silas Mercer's porch into moving water. By 9 o'clock, the gutters were overflowing. Water tapped the metal milk can beside the steps, hissed through the sword ferns, and ran beneath the porch boards. Silas sat alone beneath the yellow porch light, with Nora's chipped green mug cupped between both hands. The coffee had gone cold. He drank it anyway. He had been listening to the rain for nearly an hour when something changed in the darkness. It was not a sound. The storm had swallowed every small noise the forest might have made. It was a shape where no shape had been before, low and still beyond the porch rail, at the edge of the light. Silas did not move. Two amber eyes looked back at him. For one breath, he believed grief had finally learned how to make pictures. Then the animal turned her head, and the light caught the small V-shaped notch in her left ear. "Marlowe," he whispered. The bobcat remained 6 yards away, seated beside a clump of salal. Her coat was darkened by rain. The tawny fur along her shoulders pressed flat. Water gathered at the tips of her whiskers. One front paw rested slightly ahead of the other, the right one placed with the same careful angle, Silas remembered. She had returned, not to the door, not to the food shed, not to the place where the recovery enclosure had stood. She had come to the porch, but stopped where the wild grass began. Silas set the mug on the cedar table. The cup clicked against the wood, and Marlowe's ears rotated toward the sound. Her body tightened, though she did not rise. She stared at his hands, then at his face, and finally past him toward the rain spilling from the roof. That was when Silas understood she was not asking to come inside. She was watching the storm. The realization struck him with such tenderness that he had to look away. Months earlier, he had thought he might never see her again. That had been the point. A released bobcat was supposed to disappear into the timber and become only a story someone carried home. Silas had told himself he understood that while taking down the fencing, washing the metal water pan, and folding the blue blanket that had hung outside the pen to block the wind. He had understood it with his mind. His evenings had not. Now Marlowe sat in the rain as if she had returned to check whether the porch still existed. Silas reached slowly for the wool blanket draped over his chair. He pulled it around his shoulders, careful not to stand. Marlowe's gaze followed the movement. Her short tail gave one restrained twitch, then settled around her haunches as much as a bobtail could. "You picked a miserable night," he said softly. Her ears tipped outward. Silas almost smiled. Nora used to lift one eyebrow over the rim of the green mug whenever he stated the obvious. The memory hurt, but not sharply. It came like the warmth of the blanket, a weight he could bear. For several minutes, neither moved. Rain drummed against the roof whenever the wind leaned through the trees. Marlowe watched each silver rope of water fall from the gutter. Once, she raised her chin and snapped lightly at a droplet on her whisker. The movement was so quick and dignified that Silas pretended not to notice. A tree frog climbed onto the lowest porch step. Marlowe's pupils widened. The frog froze. Silas froze with it. After a long moment, the bobcat looked away as though the creature were beneath her concern, and the frog resumed its climb with remarkable confidence. "Lucky fellow," Silas whispered. Marlowe turned one ear toward him. The porch light flickered. She lowered her body, ready to vanish, but when the light steadied, she remained. That small decision felt larger than any welcome Silas had received in years. He did not reach for his phone. He did not call Lenora Pike. He did not step closer for proof. The wild had given him a moment, and he knew enough not to grab at it. He thought of people finding quiet comfort in stories like this while rain touched their own windows. Had they been beside him, he might have said gently that if Marlowe's return warmed them, they could leave a like, subscribe, and share where they were listening from, along with the name of an animal that had changed their life. Then he would have let the silence return. Marlowe rose. Silas's heart dropped. But she did not leave. She stepped closer by the length of her body, placing each paw carefully through the wet grass. Then she sat beneath the outer edge of the porch roof, not dry, but no longer under the heaviest rain. The distance between them was still wide enough to respect. Silas placed both hands flat on his knees. Rainwater ran from Marlowe's pale chin. The scar above her right eye gave her face a questioning look, though nothing in her posture was tame. She remained alert to every branch creak and every gust moving through the salal. Twice she glanced behind her toward the forest, measuring escape routes. Once she opened her mouth slightly, drawing in the scents of cedar boards, cooling coffee, wet earth, and the man who had once waited beside her without asking for trust. At last, she looked directly at Silas. He gave 2 soft taps on the porch rail. It was an old sound between them, though he had not made it in months. Marlowe's eyes narrowed. Not a blink. Not yet. Silas leaned back in his chair, the blanket gathered beneath his chin, while the Bobcat watched rain pour from the roof into the dark earth. The storm moved around them, vast and cold, but the porch held its small circle of yellow light. For the first time since Nora had died, Silas did not feel that he was keeping watch alone. Before Marlowe had ever appeared at the edge of his porch light, the rain had belonged to Nora. Silas Mercer had lived with that fact for nearly 2 years. Their cabin stood above a narrow branch of the Hoh River, where the road thinned to gravel and the cedar trees leaned toward one another over the ditch. In winter, the clouds seemed to settle directly on the roof. In spring, mist gathered among the ferns until the whole property looked half-remembered. Nora had loved those mornings. She used to wake before Silas, open the kitchen window an inch, and listen for the first drops striking the metal basin beneath the eaves. Then she would make coffee in the dented percolator and carry 2 mugs onto the porch, even when the cold turned their breath white. The green mug had been hers. It was heavy pottery, glazed unevenly, with a pale chip along the rim, where Silas had once knocked it against the sink. Nora had called the damage an improvement. She said perfect things made people nervous. Silas had kept using it after she was gone. At 64, he had the broad, weathered hands of a man who had spent most of his life repairing machines that carried other people safely across water. For 37 years, he had worked as a ferry mechanic out of Port Angeles, rising before dawn, packing boiled eggs and black coffee into a tin lunchbox, and coming home with diesel beneath his fingernails. She had imagined long drives, garden beds, and slow breakfasts while rain moved over the valley. Silas had imagined them too, though he had never admitted how much he depended on her to make an empty day feel purposeful. Then her illness came quietly. At first, it had been fatigue, then missed meals, then appointments that grew more serious each month. By the time Silas retired, their planned journeys had narrowed to the road between the cabin and the clinic. Nora never complained about the rain. Even in the final winter, when she tired after crossing the kitchen, she still asked him to open the porch door so she could hear it. Silas would tuck the blue blanket around her shoulders and sit beside her while water ticked against the roof. After her death, he folded that blanket and placed it over the back of her chair. He left it there through the rest of winter. Neighbors visited at first. Della Ames from the next property brought elk stew in a glass dish and returned 3 days later for the container, pretending that was the only reason she had come. Lenora Pike, the local wildlife rehabilitator, stopped by with a loaf of bread and stayed long enough to repair the loose latch on the shed. Silas thanked them both. Then he began arranging his days so no one would worry. He rose at 6. He fed the wood stove. He walked down to the mailbox whether there was mail or not. On Tuesdays, he drove into town for groceries. On Fridays, He checked the generator and sharpened tools that did not need sharpening. Every evening, he sat on the porch with Nora's mug. The routine was orderly. The silence was not. He had learned that an empty house made its own sounds. The refrigerator clicked harder. Floorboards answered footsteps that never came. Wind pressed branches against the siding with the soft scrape of someone asking to be let in. Once, Silas caught himself placing 2 spoons beside the coffee pot. He stood looking at them until the water boiled away. After that, he stored the second spoon in the back of a drawer. There were gentle moments, even then. A Steller's jay discovered the peanuts Nora had once kept in a tin and began appearing at the kitchen window every morning. Silas refused to name it, but he still placed 3 peanuts on the railing before breakfast. The bird took 2 and hid the third in the flower box, as though saving something for later. A young raccoon stole the scrub brush from beside the rain barrel and left it beneath the porch steps. Silas returned it. The raccoon stole it again the following night. By the 4th exchange, Silas set out an older brush and allowed the argument to end. Della's orange barn cat, Wallace, sometimes crossed the property with the solemn expression of a tax collector. He never accepted food from Silas, but he inspected the woodshed, sat on the truck hood, and left muddy paw prints across the windshield. "You're not helping," Silas told him once. Wallace yawned. Those small intrusions kept the cabin from becoming entirely sealed around Silas. Still, he had grown careful with affection. Losing Nora had taught him how easily love could turn a familiar room into a place filled with absences. That was why the forest suited him. It asked for nothing personal. He could walk beneath the cedars and notice what was there without being expected to hold it. Elk tracks crossed the muddy logging road. Owls called from somewhere beyond sight. Salamanders rested beneath rotting bark with their small bright bodies cool against the earth. Wild things appeared and disappeared according to needs that had nothing to do with him. Silas respected that. He had never believed the forest was lonely merely because it was quiet. On rainy afternoons, he walked the abandoned logging spur above the creek. The road had not carried timber trucks in years, and alder saplings had begun growing through its cracked surface. He carried a thermos, a folding saw, and a length of orange cord for marking fallen limbs that needed clearing. Nora had once walked there with him. She stopped for every mushroom, every feather, every stone polished by runoff. Silas had teased her for turning a 20-minute walk into an hour. After she died, he found himself doing the same. He noticed the deep red shelves of fungus growing from a hemlock stump. He noticed beads of rain suspended in spiderwebs. He noticed where a deer had scraped velvet from its antlers against a young cedar. He carried those details home as though they were things Nora might still ask about. One October morning, the rain returned after a week of clear weather. It began lightly, silvering the gravel, then strengthened until water rushed along both sides of the old road. Silas almost stayed home. The roof above the pantry had begun leaking again, and the sensible choice would have been to repair it before the weather worsened. Instead, he filled his thermos, pulled on his oilskin jacket, and headed toward the creek. Later, he would wonder whether grief had sent him there, or habit, or nothing more meaningful than a man needing to move through a house that had become too quiet. At the time, he only knew the rain sounded like Nora's fingers tapping against the green mug. So he followed it into the trees. By the time Silas reached the old logging spur, rainwater was running over the road in thin brown sheets. He moved carefully, boots sinking into the softened shoulder, one hand resting on his folding saw. The trees muffled the world. Even the creek below sounded distant beneath rain-striking cedar boughs. Halfway down the slope, he noticed fresh debris packed against the mouth of a drainage culvert. Branches, fern stems, and clotted leaves had jammed beneath the road, forcing water across the gravel instead of beneath it. Silas had cleared that culvert before. If the blockage held, the roadbed could wash out by morning. He set down his thermos and crouched beside the ditch. The runoff was cold enough to numb his fingers through his gloves. He pulled free one branch, then another, working slowly so the backed-up water would not release all at once. Something moved inside the pipe. Silas stopped. At first, he thought it was a raccoon. The shape was low and compact, wedged behind the debris where the culvert widened into shadow. Then two pale-rimmed eyes caught the gray daylight. A bobcat stared back at him. She was young, though no longer a kitten. Rain had darkened her spotted coat until she nearly disappeared against the mud-streaked metal. Her ears lay flat, and one carried a small V-shaped notch. A faint scar crossed the fur above her right eye. Silas eased backward. The bobcat opened her mouth without making a sound. "All right," he murmured. "I see you." Her gaze followed him, unblinking. She should have bolted. The uphill end of the culvert opened into brush, and there was space beside the debris for a healthy animal to squeeze through. But she remained pressed against the curved wall, shoulders tight, her right front paw held off the ground. Silas's chest tightened. He had learned from Nora that fear often looked like anger when a creature had nowhere left to go. He rose slowly and stepped away from the ditch. The bobcat's ears lifted slightly, but her body stayed rigid. Silas retrieved his thermos and walked 20 yards up the road before calling Lenora Pike. She answered on the fourth ring. "I found a bobcat in the culvert," he said. There was a pause, followed by the sound of something metal being set down. "Alive?" "Yes." "Trapped?" "I'm not sure. She's favoring one front paw. Thin, too. Do not reach in there. I wasn't planning to." "You say that like I haven't known you 15 years. Despite himself, Silas smiled. "I'm standing well back." Lenora asked for the location, then said she would bring a transfer crate, a catch pole, and heavy gloves. Silas stayed on the road while he waited, facing away so the animal would not feel watched. Rain ran from the brim of his hat and down his neck. Every few minutes, he glanced sideways. The bobcat had not moved. A banana slug crossed the road between them, taking so long that Silas suspected stubbornness. He nudged a leaf in front of it to make a bridge over the runoff. "Poor day for travel," he told it. From the culvert came a faint, dry cough. Silas turned. The bobcat had lowered herself onto her belly. Her injured paw remained tucked against her chest. She watched the slug with the fixed concentration of a hunter, but made no attempt to move toward it. That worried him more than the flattened ears. Lenora arrived 40 minutes later in an aging green pickup with a cracked wildlife rescue decal. She climbed out wearing rubber boots, a rain jacket, and the expression of someone already calculating every possible mistake. At 58, she was lean, silver-haired, and more comfortable around frightened animals than most people. She had run a licensed rehabilitation center from her property for nearly 20 years. She followed Silas down the road without unnecessary conversation. When she saw the bobcat, she crouched at a distance and studied her through binoculars. "You were right about the paw," she said, "and she's badly underweight. Can she get out?" "Maybe, but she may not have the strength." Lenora placed the crate near the ditch and covered 3 sides with dark canvas. Then she prepared a small portion of raw venison from a sealed container. The scent reached the culvert almost immediately. The bobcat's nose moved. There it was, the first sign of interest stronger than fear. Lenora slid the meat inside the crate and backed away. Nothing happened. Rain filled the silence. After 10 minutes, the bobcat shifted an inch forward, then froze. Her right paw touched the ground briefly before lifting again. Her whiskers angled toward the food. Silas stood beside a cedar trunk, hands loose at his sides. He remembered Nora coaxing a frightened wren from their kitchen after it had flown through an open window. She had darkened the room, opened one clear path, and waited. No chasing, no grabbing, just patience. Silas lowered his eyes. The bobcat moved again. One step, then another. She stopped at the culvert mouth, close enough for Silas to see burrs tangled along her belly and the worn ends of the whiskers on her right side. Her amber eyes flicked toward Lenora, then toward Silas. A gust shook water from the branches. The bobcat flinched back. Silas held his breath. For several seconds, she seemed ready to vanish deeper into the pipe. Instead, she leaned forward and sniffed the air again. Lenora did not move. Silas did not move. The bobcat limped into the crate. The instant her hind paws cleared the door, Lenora pulled the release cord. The gate dropped with a metallic clang. The bobcat whirled, struck once at the bars, then pressed against the rear wall. Her breathing came fast and shallow. Silas felt no triumph, only sorrow that help had to begin by frightening her. Lenora covered the front of the crate, dimming the world inside. She's safe for now. Silas picked up the forgotten thermos. Mud coated one side, and the coffee inside had gone lukewarm. He looked toward the culvert, now empty except for rainwater and leaves. Does she have a chance? Lenora rested a hand on the crate, not touching the animal within. She came out for food, she said. That means she hasn't given up. The bobcat shifted beneath the canvas. A single amber eye appeared through the narrow gap. It remained fixed on Silas all the way to the truck. Lenora kept the bobcat at her rehabilitation property for the first 3 nights. The center sat on 12 wooded acres beyond Forks, hidden behind alder groves and a sagging wire gate. Most of the enclosures stood far from the house, separated by thick brush, so recovering animals would not grow used to people. Silas had helped repair several of them over the years, but he had never seen one occupied by an animal that had looked directly at him from a dark culvert. She has a strained shoulder, a badly bruised paw, and no fractures, she said. Dehydrated, too thin, nothing we cannot work with. Silas stood at his kitchen counter, one hand around Nora's green mug. That sounds hopeful. It is, but she's throwing herself at the panels whenever I enter. His grip tightened. Can I do anything? Lenora was quiet for a moment. I need the old forest enclosure rebuilt before she improves enough to move. The roof mesh is loose, and the western wall has rot. Silas was already reaching for his coat. The forest enclosure stood at the far edge of Lenora's property, beneath hemlocks and cedar. It was larger than the treatment pens, with logs for climbing, dense cover, and a narrow shift gate connecting it to a sheltered den box. Years of rain had softened 2 posts and bent a section of wire where a fallen limb had struck it. Silas worked through the afternoon without approaching the clinic. He replaced the rotten wood, tightened the roof mesh, and fitted a new latch that could be operated silently. Rainwater dripped from the cedar tips onto his shoulders. The air smelled of wet bark, iron, and fresh-cut fur. At dusk, Lenora brought him a bowl of stew. You missed lunch, she said. I had coffee. That is not lunch. It had milk. That is not a defense. He accepted the bowl. A raven landed on the enclosure roof and watched him eat with open disapproval. Silas broke off a piece of bread, then remembered Lenora's rules and kept it. The raven clicked its beak. You have food in the forest, Silas told it. The bird leaned closer, unconvinced. By the 3rd day, the enclosure was ready. Lenora moved the bobcat after dark when the property was quiet. She placed the covered transfer crate inside, opened the door remotely, and withdrew. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. Then the bobcat emerged low to the ground. She did not explore like a curious animal. She moved like water, seeking the smallest crack. She circled the perimeter, tested the wire with one paw, climbed halfway up a cedar trunk, and dropped back down when her injured shoulder protested. After that, she vanished into the den box. Silas watched from behind a screen of salal, far enough away that the bobcat could not see him clearly. "She needs a name for the medical records," Lenora whispered. Silas shook his head. "She doesn't need one from me." Lenora glanced toward the dark den opening. "She already has one from somebody. We just do not know it." They left the matter there. For the next week, Silas returned each morning to finish small repairs that did not truly need finishing. He replaced one board on the service walkway. He sanded a rough edge from the feeding hatch. He moved a drainage stone by 1/2 inch, then moved it back. "You can visit," she told him. "You do not have to pretend the latch is a lifelong project." "I'm not visiting." "Of course not." Silas sat behind the viewing screen anyway. At first, the bobcat remained hidden whenever he was near. He heard her before he saw her. The faint scrape of claws against bark, the rustle of cedar duff, the soft thump of her short tail against the den wall. Lenora taught him the rules. Do not stare. Do not approach directly. Do not speak unless necessary. Do not remain so long that the animal stopped resting. Silas obeyed. He sat with his shoulders turned slightly away and read old maintenance manuals he had brought from home. The pages smelled of machine oil and damp paper. He rarely absorbed a sentence, but the quiet rhythm of turning pages gave his hands something to do. On the 4th morning, the bobcat appeared behind a fallen log. Only her ears and eyes showed. Silas kept reading. A full minute passed. Then her head rose higher. The notch in her left ear was unmistakable. Her scar had begun to show more clearly as the mud left her coat. She watched him with the hard concentration of a creature measuring danger. Silas turned a page. The paper tore slightly at the corner. The bobcat ducked. "I know," he said softly, before remembering he was not supposed to speak. Lenora, standing behind him, covered a smile. The bobcat emerged again several minutes later. That became their first routine. Silas arrived after the morning feeding. He sat behind the screen. The bobcat waited until he stopped shifting in the chair. Then she appeared somewhere different each day. Once, she perched on a platform with her injured paw tucked beneath her chest. Once, she crouched beside the water pan and stared at her own reflection until a leaf landed in it. She struck the surface so sharply that water splashed across her face. She leaped backward, offended by the result. Silas looked down at his manual so she would not see him smile. Another morning, she carried a small cedar cone into the den box. 10 minutes later, she brought it back out and abandoned it in the exact place where she had found it, as though dissatisfied with the arrangement. The warmest moment came when a field mouse ran along the outside of the enclosure. The bobcat flattened instantly, shoulders rolling beneath her spotted coat. Her pupils widened. Her tail twitched once. She followed the mouse for 6 feet, forgetting Silas entirely. The mouse disappeared under a root. The bobcat sat down and stared at the spot with such solemn betrayal that Silas had to press his lips together. Those small glimpses mattered more than he expected. Her fear had not vanished. If Lenora entered to clean, the bobcat retreated at once. If a truck door slammed near the house, she climbed to the highest platform. At night, trail cameras showed her pacing the fence line, searching for a way out. But she ate. She groomed. She began placing weight on the injured paw. Silas understood that none of this meant she trusted him. Recovery was not affection. Tolerance was not a bond. He reminded himself of that whenever hope tried to become something greedy. Still, he had spent nearly 2 years living among objects that belonged to absence. Now, for 40 quiet minutes each morning, another living creature occupied the space beyond his vision. She did not need conversation. She did not need him cheerful. She did not ask what he planned to do with the rest of his life. She only needed him to sit still enough that she could decide he was not a threat. That was a task Silas understood. On the 10th morning, he arrived carrying Nora's green mug instead of the metal travel cup. The bobcat was already outside the den. She saw him. Her body tightened, but she did not retreat. Silas sat behind the screen, turned slightly away, and placed the mug beside his boot. For the first time, the bobcat remained in the open while he settled into the chair. The distance between them had not changed. Something quieter had. The first real change came on a morning when rain gathered in the trees, but had not yet reached the ground. The air felt swollen with it. Every cedar branch hung dark and still, holding more water than seemed possible. Somewhere beyond the rehabilitation property, a thrush called once and fell silent. Silas arrived earlier than usual. He carried Nora's green mug in one hand and a small toolbox in the other, though there was nothing left to repair. The latch worked smoothly. The roof mesh held. Even the drainage channel had stopped collecting needles after he widened it the previous afternoon. Lenora stood outside the clinic rinsing metal bowls. "You know," she said, "most people bring flowers when they want an excuse to visit. Flowers don't fix hinges. There are no broken hinges." Lenora glanced at the toolbox. "You brought a tape measure and one screwdriver." Silas looked down. "Traveling light." She shook her head and returned to the bowls. The bobcat was nowhere visible when Silas reached the forest enclosure. He placed the toolbox beneath the viewing screen, settled into the wooden chair, and set the green mug beside his right boot. Steam rose briefly from the coffee before disappearing into the damp air. He opened a maintenance manual to a page about hydraulic pumps. The words were familiar. He had rebuilt dozens of those systems aboard ferries, often in cramped engine rooms where the air tasted of hot oil and salt. Once, years earlier, Nora had teased him that he could diagnose a failing pump by sound, but somehow never heard the kitchen faucet dripping. The memory passed through him softly. He turned a page. Something shifted behind the fallen log. Silas kept his eyes lowered. The bobcat emerged in stages. First came the tips of her ears, then the pale fur around her eyes, then the scar above her right brow. She remained crouched for several breaths before stepping into the open. Her injured paw touched the ground more firmly now. She crossed to the cedar trunk and rubbed one cheek along the bark, leaving scent in a slow, deliberate stroke. Then she turned and repeated the motion on the other side, as though correcting an imbalance. Silas pretended to read. The bobcat moved toward the water pan. During the night, wind had dropped 3 cedar needles into it. She stared at them with immediate suspicion. Then she dipped one paw into the water, hooked the needles together, and lifted them out. They slipped free and landed against her chest. She jumped backward. Silas pressed his thumb against the corner of the page to keep from smiling. The bobcat approached the pan again, this time more carefully. She scooped the needles onto the ground and sat beside them, looking pleased with the result. A single drop fell from the roof mesh and struck the pan. The sound was small. The bobcat raised her head. Another drop followed, then another. Rain began gradually, tapping the leaves above the enclosure before finding its way through the branches. The light changed from gray to silver. The smell of wet cedar deepened around them. The bobcat did not retreat to her den. Instead, she walked to the outer edge of the enclosure and sat beneath a platform where the rain could still reach her shoulders. She lifted her face toward the trees. Silas watched from the edge of his vision. She seemed different in rain, not tame, not relaxed in the way a house cat might have been. Her ears continued turning toward every sound, and her body remained ready to spring, but something in her breathing softened. The tight line of her spine eased. Water purled along her whiskers. One drop gathered at the end of a broken whisker on her right side and hung there, trembling. The bobcat crossed her eyes slightly, trying to see it. Silas had to lower his head. When the drop finally fell, She licked her nose and looked around as though someone else might be responsible. The quiet warmth of it moved him more deeply than he expected. He had seen Nora do something similar on rainy mornings, tilting her face beyond the porch roof until a drop landed on her cheek. She always laughed before Silas could warn her she was getting wet. The bobcat did not laugh, but she stayed beneath the rain. Silas closed the manual. The movement caught her attention. Her head turned toward him immediately. He froze with one hand resting on the open page. For several seconds, the distance between them felt sharp again. The bobcat's ears angled forward. Her pupils narrowed. She looked at his face, then at the green mug, then back at his hands. Silas lowered his gaze. He did not know why he spoke. Perhaps the rain made silence feel less fragile. Nora liked weather like this, he said. The bobcat remained still. She said rain made a house honest, showed you every loose board and every bad nail. A faint gust moved through the enclosure. The bobcat's nose lifted. Silas could smell coffee, wet earth, and the medicinal sharpness of the disinfectant Lenora used near the clinic. Beneath it came the green scent of crushed fern. I never understood what she meant, he continued. Not then. He stopped. The bobcat looked away toward the trees. Silas felt foolish, but not ashamed. Talking to her was easier than talking to the people who asked whether he was doing better. The bobcat had no use for that question. A small brown wren landed on the enclosure roof. The bobcat dropped instantly into a crouch. Her rear legs tightened. Her short tail flicked once. The wren hopped along the wire, peering down. Silas watched the bobcat's attention sharpen until her whole body seemed gathered around the bird. Then the wren released a thin stream of water from the mesh with its feet. The droplets struck the bobcat between the ears. She jerked upright and stared at the roof. The wren flew away. Silas looked down at his mug, shoulders shaking once. The bobcat glanced toward him. He became still. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she sat again beneath the platform. Rain strengthened, drumming softly against the enclosure roof. Silas remained in the chair while the bobcat watched it fall through the branches. 20 minutes passed. The coffee cooled. The manual lay forgotten on his knees. At last, the bobcat turned her head toward him. Silas met her eyes only briefly, then softened his gaze and looked toward the ground between them. He had learned not to ask for more. The bobcat's eyelids lowered. Slowly, deliberately. They closed almost completely, then opened again. Silas stopped breathing. He knew enough about cats to understand that a slow blink did not erase fear. It was not surrender. It was not permission to come closer. But it was a choice. For one heartbeat, the animal had allowed herself not to watch him. Silas looked down before hope could frighten her. His hands had tightened around the edges of the manual. He loosened them carefully. "Thank you," he whispered. The bobcat turned back toward the rain. A cedar needle landed beside her paw. She pushed it away with one precise movement, then settled more comfortably beneath the silver drops. Silas sat until the coffee was cold and the rain had darkened the shoulders of his coat. When he finally stood, the bobcat did not run. She watched him gather the mug and toolbox. As he reached the path, he glanced back once. Her eyes narrowed again. Not fully, but enough. After the slow blink, nothing changed quickly. That was how Silas knew it mattered. Marlowe did not begin waiting for him at the gate. She did not approach the viewing screen or soften into anything that could be mistaken for a pet. Most mornings, she still watched him from behind the fallen log until he had been seated for several minutes. Some days, she stayed inside the den box and gave him only the faint scrape of claws against wood. Silas accepted each version of her. He arrived shortly after Lenora's morning feeding, carrying the green mug and whatever harmless object could justify his presence. One day, it was a coil of rope that needed no coiling. Another day, it was a drawer of old screws he sorted by size across a towel on his knees. Marlowe seemed to prefer the screws. Each soft metallic click made one ear turn toward him. When Silas dropped a washer, it rolled beneath the screen and stopped near the enclosure fence. Marlowe stalked it from 10 feet away. Her belly lowered, her shoulders shifted beneath her spotted coat. She crept close enough to extend a paw, then struck the washer so neatly that it flipped onto its edge and spun. She leaped backward. The washer circled twice before falling flat. Silas waited until she retreated behind the log before retrieving it. "You defeated it," he told her. Only the notched tip of one ear remained visible. By the second week, Lenora had increased Marlowe's food and hidden portions throughout the enclosure. Venison went beneath a hollow branch. Another portion was secured high enough on a log to require climbing. Small amounts were placed along scent trails rather than in a bowl. "She needs to work for meals again," Lenora explained. "Strength, coordination, decisions, all of it." Silas helped only after Marlowe had shifted safely into the den. He moved logs, checked platforms, and built a narrow balance beam from a wind-fallen cedar limb. The first version was too smooth. Lenora stood beside it with her arms crossed. "She'll slide." "I sanded the splinters." "You sanded away the bark." Silas looked at the polished wood. That was thorough. It was furniture. He replaced it the following day. The rough limb earned Lenora's approval and Marlowe's suspicion. She circled it 3 times before stepping up. Her right paw tested the bark. Then she crossed the whole length with her tail held level for balance. At the far end, she found the hidden food and carried it beneath the platform to eat alone. Silas felt a quiet satisfaction he had not known since leaving the ferry yard. Machines had always answered work with evidence, a clean ignition, a steady gauge, an engine settling into rhythm. Recovery offered smaller signs, a paw placed more firmly, a shoulder moving without hesitation, an animal choosing the highest platform because she could reach it again. His own days began settling around those signs. He rose before the alarm, opened the kitchen window an inch, as Nora once had, and listened to the weather. He made coffee in the dented percolator, fed the Stellar's jay, and drove to Lenora's with the truck heater rattling beneath the dashboard. The jay had become demanding. If Silas forgot the peanuts, it landed on the porch rail and struck the wood with its beak. One morning, it followed him to the truck and perched on the side mirror. "You have wings," Silas said. "Fine breakfast." The bird stared through the window until he went back inside. At the rehabilitation center, Marlowe developed opinions of her own. She disliked the yellow rake Lenora used on the service path. The moment it appeared, she climbed onto the platform and glared down at it. The blue rake caused no concern. "She has standards," Silas said. "She has eyes," Lenora replied. "That yellow thing offends everyone." Marlowe also refused to drink if a cedar cone floated in the water pan. She would sit beside the rim and look toward the clinic until someone removed it. Yet she regularly dropped bark into the same pan herself. Silas found the contradiction comforting. It reminded him that wildness had preferences, habits, and private rules. The name Marlowe had settled quietly between them. Silas used it only when they were alone. "Marlowe," he said one rainy morning. Her ears turned. She did not look at him, but she did not leave. The days grew colder. Mist lingered over the property until noon, beating along the wire and silvering Marlowe's whiskers. Silas brought the blue blanket from home and hung it outside the windward side of the viewing screen. It had once covered Nora's knees. For a moment, he stood with it in his hands, breathing in the faint cedar smell that had replaced every trace of her. Lenora noticed, but said nothing. The blanket blocked the draft and softened the outline of Silas's chair. On the first morning it hung there, Marlowe paused beside it and sniffed through the wire, her mouth opening slightly as she studied its scent. Silas wondered what she found. Wood smoke, perhaps. Coffee. The cabin. Rain. Maybe grief had a scent too. Marlowe climbed onto the fallen log and groomed the fur between the toes of her healing paw. Halfway through, she lost her balance and stepped into the water pan. She sprang out, scattering droplets across the cedar duff. Silas stared intently at his coffee. Marlowe shook one paw, then the other, as if the ground had betrayed her. Afterward, she climbed to the highest platform and sat with her back toward him in pointed dignity. The warmth that rose in Silas was not laughter alone. It was recognition. The house had begun changing because he had begun carrying pieces of the day home. Cedar needles clung to his coat. Mud marked the kitchen floor. The green mug no longer sat untouched beside an empty chair. He still missed Nora in every room, but he had stopped believing that missing her required the rest of his life to remain still. One evening, as Silas prepared to leave, Marlowe descended from the platform and approached the fallen log. He gave 2 light taps on the wooden screen. She stopped. Her amber eyes rested on him. Then she lowered herself onto the damp cedar needles, not hidden and not close, while rain began whispering through the roof mesh. Silas sat down again. Neither had asked the other to stay. For another 10 quiet minutes, both did. Marlowe's release was scheduled for the first clear morning after a week of rain. Lenora chose a ridge 3 miles beyond Silas's cabin, inside the same stretch of forest where the culvered creek joined a larger ravine. The area offered dense cover, clean water, fallen timber, and enough distance from the road to reduce the chance of another accident. Silas understood every reason. He still slept poorly the night before. At dawn, mist lay low between the cedars. Water dripped from the roof in slow, patient intervals, and the kitchen window had fogged at the corners. Silas made coffee, but left most of it untouched. He fed the Steller's jay 4 peanuts instead of 3. The bird took all 4 without gratitude. "You're welcome," Silas said. He folded the blue blanket and placed it on the passenger seat of the truck, though Lenora had not asked him to bring it. Then he drove toward the rehabilitation center with the green mug resting in the cup holder. Marlowe had already been moved into the transfer crate. The canvas covering concealed most of her, but Silas could hear her shifting inside. One claw scraped briefly against the plastic floor. Then all went quiet. Lenora checked the door latch twice. She passed every test, she said. Strong climb, clean gait, good hunting response, no unhealthy interest in people. Silas nodded. That last part should have comforted him. It did, mostly. They drove separately to the ridge. Lenora led in the green pickup, while Silas followed along a narrow forest road, silvered with puddles. Branches brushed both sides of his truck. The blue blanket slid from the passenger seat onto the floor at the first sharp turn. At the release site, the sky had begun clearing behind the clouds. Light moved weakly through the canopy, turning beads of water on the salon leaves white. Lenora carried the crate 50 yards from the road. Silas carried nothing. They placed Marlowe near the edge of a fern-covered slope. Below, a creek moved over stone with a low, steady sound. Wind carried the scents of wet cedar, moss, and distant elk. Lenora attached a cord to the crate door. "You can stand behind that hemlock," she told Silas. He did. Marlowe would choose the moment. No one would pull her out. No one would call to her. Lenora stepped back and drew the cord. The crate door lifted. Nothing emerged. For several minutes, the opening remained dark. Silas could see only one amber eye. It watched the forest first, then Lenora, then him. His chest tightened, but he did not move. A varied thrush called from somewhere down the slope. The sound was thin and haunting, like a whistle carried through glass. Marlowe's nose appeared at the crate opening. She tested the air. One front paw touched the cedar needles, then the other. Her right paw took her weight without hesitation. Marlowe stepped fully into the forest. For one breath, she stood in the open, compact and golden beneath the gray trees. The scar above her right eye had faded beneath new fur, though the V-notch in her left ear remained clear. She looked toward Silas. He gave 2 soft taps against the trunk beside him. Marlowe's ears turned. That was all. She moved downhill in 3 silent strides and disappeared into the ferns. Silas kept watching the place where she had been. A branch trembled farther below. Then nothing. Lenora lowered the cord. "She did well," she said. Silas nodded again. His throat would not allow more. They waited 20 minutes before collecting the empty crate. Lenora spoke about trail cameras, territory range, and the possibility that Marlowe might travel several miles before settling. Silas listened carefully. He also listened for movement in the ferns. None came. On the drive home, the blue blanket remained on the floor of the truck. The green mug rattled lightly in the cup holder whenever Silas crossed a pothole. The cabin looked unchanged when he arrived. That surprised him. The porch rail was still damp. The Steller's jay still waited near the flower box. Wallace, Della's orange cat, sat beneath the truck as though guarding it from theft. Silas carried the blanket inside. He nearly draped it over Nora's chair again. Instead, he folded it into the cedar chest. The days that followed felt longer than they should have. Silas no longer drove to Lenora's each morning. There was no latch to inspect, no water pan to clear, no yellow rake to criticize. He tried returning to his old routine, but it no longer fit. He walked the logging spur. He repaired the pantry roof. He sorted screws that had already been sorted. When rain came, he sat on the porch and listened. He never expected Marlowe to return. That was what he told himself. Then, 12 evenings after the release, he noticed movement beyond the rail. A bobcat stood beneath the alder at the edge of the yard. Silas did not breathe. Marlowe remained partly hidden, her spotted coat breaking apart among the wet leaves. She watched him for less than a minute, then turned and vanished. Silas sat until darkness covered the yard. She returned 4 nights later. This time she came during rain. She stopped near the salal, where the porch light ended, seated herself, and watched water fall from the roof. Silas placed both hands on his knees. He did not offer food. He did not call her name. A wild bobcat who associated porches with meals could quickly become a bobcat in danger. Lenora had been clear about that. Affection could not excuse carelessness. So Silas simply stayed. Marlowe remained for 7 minutes. The next rainy evening, she stayed for 12. Her visits never followed a dependable schedule. Sometimes 2 weeks passed without a sign. Sometimes she appeared twice in 3 days. She came only when the weather softened the world, never on bright afternoons, and never close enough to touch. She seemed especially interested in the gutter. Water spilled from one low corner in a steady rope, and Marlowe would sit with her head tilted, watching it strike the stones below. Once, she reached out and slapped the stream. The water broke across her face. She jumped sideways, then stared accusingly at the roof. Silas lowered his mug to hide a smile. Another evening, the Steller's jay landed on the porch rail between them. Marlowe crouched. The jay froze. Silas froze too. After a tense moment, the jay dropped a peanut and fled. Marlowe sniffed it, dismissed it, and returned to watching the rain. Silas later found the peanut beneath his chair, soaked and swollen. The quiet joy of those evenings did not come from believing Marlowe had chosen him over the forest. She had not. She hunted where he could not see. She slept beneath roots, crossed ridges, marked fallen logs, and lived by instincts older than any porch. But on certain wet nights, she returned to the edge of his light. Silas began leaving Nora's empty chair beside his own. Not for Marlowe, not exactly. He simply liked the shape of 2 chairs facing the rain. One November evening, Marlowe settled beneath the outer edge of the roof, while silver waters streamed beyond her. Silas tapped the rail twice. She gave one slow blink, and both looked toward the forest, listening as rain moved through the cedars. The porch had not taken her from the wild. It had only become another quiet place within it. The first warning appeared so quietly that Silas almost mistook it for weather. Marlowe had always arrived after rain began, never before. She seemed to wait until the forest darkened and the roof started speaking in its steady language. But near the end of November, she appeared beneath the alder while the sky was still pale and dry. Silas had been carrying split cedar from the woodshed. He stopped with 2 pieces balanced against his chest. Marlowe stood at the tree line, her body low and tense. Her ears moved constantly, tracking sounds from the ridge above the cabin. She looked toward Silas only once before turning back to the forest. "You're early," he said. She did not settle beside the sallow. Instead, she crossed the yard in a crooked path, pausing at the stump, the rain barrel, and the bottom porch post. At each place, she pressed her cheek against the wood, or lifted her short tail and marked the boundary with quick, deliberate movements. Silas placed the cedar beside the steps. Marlowe circled the cabin once. That was new. She moved behind the woodshed, passed beneath the kitchen window, and reappeared near the driveway. Her injured paw showed no weakness, but her stride had lost its usual patience. She stopped often and stared uphill. Silas followed her gaze. The ridge was hidden behind a wall of cedar and hemlock. A windstorm earlier in the month had brought down several trees along the old logging road, but nothing else seemed disturbed. Marlowe returned to the porch. She did not watch the gutter. She did not sit. She paced along the outer edge of the light, 6 steps in one direction, 6 steps back. When Silas shifted his weight, she flinched. He lowered himself into his chair. The green mug rested on the cedar table, untouched. Steam curled into the cold air. Beside it lay a small paper sack of biscuits Della had brought that afternoon. Marlowe paused near the porch post and sniffed. Silas glanced at the sack. "You would not like them," he said. "Della forgot the salt." Marlowe's ears turned toward him. She called it healthier. For the first time that evening, some of the tension left Silas's face. Della's biscuits had been hard enough to support a table leg. Silas had eaten one to be polite and saved the rest in case the generator needed leveling. A Steller's jay landed beside the sack and pecked at the folded paper. Silas waved one hand. "Not those. I am trying to protect you." The jay seized a crumb and flew to the gutter. Marlowe watched it go, but did not crouch. That worried Silas. The bird hopped along the roof edge, carrying its prize. Marlowe usually followed every movement with complete focus. This time, her attention snapped back toward the ridge before the jay disappeared. A low sound rolled through the forest. Not thunder. It was deeper and shorter, like a heavy object shifting against earth. Every line of her body changed. Her head lowered, her legs bent, her ears flattened, not toward Silas, but toward the mountain. Then she vanished into the trees. Silas remained in his chair, listening. Nothing followed except the small scrape of the jay trying to break Della's biscuit against the gutter. The next morning, Silas walked the abandoned logging spur. The rain had not yet arrived, but the ground felt soft beneath his boots. Water moved under the road in places where the surface appeared dry. Ferns leaned downhill as though pressed by an invisible hand. Near the ridge, he found a fresh crack in the gravel. It ran from the uphill bank across half the road, narrow as a pencil line. Silas crouched and touched the edge. The soil beneath was wet and loose. He marked the place with orange cord. Farther along, 2 young alders had tilted overnight, their roots partly exposed. Mud seeped around them in slow brown ribbons. Silas stood beneath the dripping branches and felt the old mechanic's instinct stir in him. Machines warned people before they failed. A vibration changed. A bearing heated. A gauge trembled just beyond its usual range. The earth gave warnings too. People were simply worse at reading them. He called Lenora from the road. She listened without interrupting. "How much rain is forecast?" she asked. "Several inches by the weekend. I'll contact the county and the ranger station. Do not go back up there alone." "I'm standing on it now." Lenora sighed. "You have a special talent for telling me useful things too late." Silas looked at the crack. "I'm leaving. Today, Silas." He smiled faintly. "Yes, Lenora." On his way home, he found bobcat tracks along the muddy shoulder. They crossed the road 3 separate times within a short distance. Marlowe had not been traveling directly. She had been moving back and forth, scent checking, searching. One print was pressed so deeply into the mud that water had already filled it. Silas placed his hand beside it without touching. She had known before he did. Over the following days, the weather closed around the valley. Clouds lowered until the highest cedars vanished into gray. Rain began as a whisper, then strengthened into an endless rushing sound. The creek below the cabin turned brown and climbed over stones that had remained dry all autumn. Marlowe came each evening. Her visits no longer felt peaceful. She paced the yard, rubbed against the same porch post, and disappeared for minutes at a time before returning from a different direction. Once, she climbed onto the fallen log beyond the woodshed and stood upright against the cedar trunk, stretching high to score the bark with her claws. The sharp ripping sound carried through the rain. Silas had seen bobcats mark territory before, but never with such urgency. He called Lenora again. "She may be responding to another animal," Lenora said, "or disturbed prey. Flooding changes movement patterns. She keeps looking uphill. That matters." Silas stared through the kitchen window. Marlowe was seated beside the rain barrel, but her body faced the ridge instead of the porch. "Could we bring her back into care?" "Not because she's restless. She's healthy and wild. We cannot confine her because the forest makes us nervous." Silas knew Lenora was right. The knowledge did not ease him. That evening, he repaired the loose porch rail even though the storm had already begun. Rain ran down the back of his coat while he tightened the bolts. Marlowe watched from beneath the alder. When the wrench slipped and clattered across the boards, she jumped sideways. Silas held still. After a moment, Marlowe approached the outer edge of the porch. She sniffed the wrench, sneezed once at the metal scent, and retreated with offended dignity. "You approved the old rail, did you?" Silas asked. She sat in the rain. A gust turned the gutter stream sideways, splashing her shoulder. Marlowe glared at the roof, then moved exactly 6 inches beyond its reach. Silas smiled, but the warmth lasted only a moment. He had learned not to expect wild things to stay. Now he was beginning to fear what might make one leave. Before dawn on Friday, a deep cracking sound woke him. The cabin windows trembled. Silas sat upright in bed, whistling as rain hammered the roof. Somewhere above the creek, the mountain shifted again. The sound came again before Silas reached the bedroom door. It began as a groan beneath the rain, low enough to feel through the floorboards. Then came a series of sharp cracks from the ridge, like trunks splitting under impossible weight. Silas pulled on his trousers, shoved bare feet into rubber boots, and took the flashlight from the kitchen hook. The porch door fought the wind. When he forced it open, rain struck his face sideways. The yellow light above the steps showed only a few yards of yard before the storm erased everything else. Water sheeted over the boards. The metal milk can had toppled and was rolling against the rail with a hollow clang. Silas caught it with one boot. "Enough of that," he muttered. The small act steadied him. He swept the flashlight toward the alder. No amber eyes appeared. "Marlowe." The name left his mouth before he could stop it. Another crack sounded uphill. Then the mountain answered. The noise was not like thunder. Thunder passed overhead and faded. This grew as it moved, a deep grinding rush of earth, stone, and broken timber sliding through the dark. Silas gripped the porch post. The cabin trembled. Somewhere beyond the woodshed, a tree fell with a tearing crash. The porch light flickered and went out. Darkness closed around him, except for the narrow white beam of the flashlight. Then, between gusts, he heard a short rasp near the rain barrel. Silas turned the light. Marlowe stood there. Her coat was plastered dark against her body. Mud streaked her legs. Her ears were flattened, and her mouth was open as she drew in the storm's scents. She did not look at Silas. Her whole body faced the ridge. A second wave of debris moved above them. Marlowe sprang onto the fallen log beside the woodshed. She climbed halfway up the cedar trunk, claws biting into wet bark, then dropped and paced 3 quick circles. Silas had never seen her move without purpose. Now she looked pulled in 2 directions. The forest called her uphill. The cabin, with its small circle of memory and light, held her at the edge of the yard. Silas stepped back beneath the porch roof. "Go where you know," he said. Marlowe's head snapped toward him. For one heartbeat, the flashlight caught the scar above her right eye, and the rain trembling from her whiskers. Silas gave 2 taps against the porch rail. The old signal sounded thin against the storm. Marlowe stared at him. Then she turned and vanished behind the woodshed. Silas moved to follow, but stopped at the steps. Chasing her into darkness would help no one. He repeated that while every part of him wanted to run after her. He returned inside and called the county emergency line. The dispatcher already knew about the slide. Part of the upper logging road had collapsed, and runoff was crossing the lower road near the creek. She told him to stay inside and prepare to leave if the water rose. Silas called Lenora next. She answered at once. "I heard it," she said. "Are you safe?" "For now." "What about Marlowe?" "She was here. She left toward the trees." Lenora went quiet. "She knows that ground better than we do," she said. "She went uphill. Maybe toward higher cover. Maybe." Lenora did not offer false certainty. "Stay out of the woods, Silas." He looked at the flashlight in his hand. "I know." "Say it like you mean it." "I'll stay out." After the call, he placed towels along the pantry wall where the roof had started leaking. One towel had tiny blue fish printed across it, a gift Nora had bought because she said plain towels lacked courage. Water struck the fish 1 drop at a time. Silas set a cooking pot beneath the worst leak. The first drop landed with a hollow plink. Soon the sound became almost cheerful. He disliked it for that. The power remained out. Silas lit the cracked lantern and set it on the kitchen table. Its flame made the windows into black mirrors. In one, he saw himself standing with wet hair, an oilskin coat over his nightshirt, and 1 boot still unlaced. Nora would have laughed. The thought warmed him for half a second. Then he looked toward the yard. At 3 in the morning, the creek reached the bottom of the old fence. Silas packed medication, dry socks, the green mug, and Nora's photograph. He placed the blue blanket over the back of his chair but could not decide whether to take it. In the end, he folded it into the bag. Wallace appeared on the porch shortly before dawn. The orange cat clung to the top step, soaked and furious. Silas opened the door. Wallace entered without permission, crossed the kitchen, and climbed onto Nora's chair. "You live half a mile away," Silas told him. Wallace tucked his paws beneath his chest. Silas called Della. Her barn had flooded at one end, and she had moved the animals to higher ground. Wallace had apparently disagreed with the plan. "Keep him there," she said. "He likes you more than he admits." "He has never admitted anything." Wallace closed his eyes. At dawn, the storm weakened enough for the yard to take shape. Mud covered the grass behind the woodshed. A young alder lay across the drive. The upper slope remained hidden by mist, but the smell had changed. Wet cedar mixed with raw earth, crushed roots, and torn vegetation. Silas stepped onto the porch. The rain had softened. He searched the mud near the salal. Raccoon tracks crossed beneath the steps. Wallace's round prints led from the driveway to the door. Near the rain barrel, Silas found the marks Marlowe had made while circling. Beyond them, her tracks ran behind the woodshed. He followed only as far as the porch post allowed. The prints continued toward the tree line. Then a wide tongue of muddy water crossed them and erased everything. Silas stood with one hand resting on the repaired rail. The gutter spilled beside him. A Steller's jay landed on the flower box, looked at the empty peanut tin, and struck the wood once. Silas brought back 3 peanuts and placed them on the rail. The bird took one. Silas waited for movement beneath the alder. Morning passed, then afternoon. The rain kept falling. Marlowe did not return. By noon, the county had blocked the lower road. A deputy parked near the washed-out culvert and told residents to remain on their properties unless the creek rose again. The upper logging spur had collapsed in 2 places. Trees, stone, and mud had cut across the ravine where Marlowe's territory began. Silas listened from beneath the porch roof, with rain dripping from the deputy's hat. "Search crews will check the slide once the ground settles," the man said. "Not before." Silas looked toward the ridge. "How long?" "Could be tomorrow, could be several days." The deputy followed his gaze and seemed to understand that Silas was not asking about the road. "You missing livestock?" "A bobcat." "She was rehabilitated nearby," Silas explained. "Released in that drainage." "Wild animal?" "Yes." The deputy shifted his weight. "Then she may have moved before the slide." "She may have." Silas knew how unreasonable hope could sound when spoken aloud. After the deputy left, he walked the edge of the property. He did not enter the forest. He kept the promise he had made to Lenora, though each step away from the trees felt like a small betrayal. He checked beneath the woodshed, along the fence, near the rain barrel, and beside the alder, where Marlowe usually first appeared. The mud held stories. Deer had crossed during the night. Their narrow tracks led toward lower ground. A raccoon had searched beneath the flower box. Wallace had walked twice around the truck before returning to Nora's chair. There were no bobcat prints. Silas placed a trail camera near the tree line, angled away from the porch so it would capture animals entering from the ridge. He mounted another beside the creek path. Then he waited. Waiting had once been something he did beside hospital beds and clinic doors. He had hated it then too. Lenora arrived in the afternoon with waterproof maps spread across the hood of her pickup. She had marked likely travel corridors in red pencil. High ridges, abandoned service roads, narrow strips of forest untouched by the slide. Marlowe knew the creek, she said. She knew where the ground rose. Animals often move before people recognize danger. She came to the cabin instead. She may have been passing through. She circled it 3 times. Lenora looked at him. Silas regretted the sharpness in his voice. "I'm sorry. You're afraid." He rested both hands on the truck hood. Rain struck the map and blurred one red line before Lenora covered it with her sleeve. "She could be injured," he said. "Yes." "She could be trapped." "Yes." "You are not supposed to agree with everything. I am not going to comfort you with something I cannot know." That was why Silas trusted her. They checked the lower trails together, remaining far from unstable ground. Lenora carried binoculars and a radio. Silas brought the folding saw, 2 flashlights, and the blue blanket stuffed inside a dry bag. He knew the blanket would be little use to a wild bobcat. He brought it anyway. Near the creek, the forest had been rearranged. Brown water pushed through beds of fern, branches hung from shrubs at shoulder height, showing how high the flood had reached. A cedar trunk lay across the trail, with its roots exposed like dark fingers. The air smelled of clay and broken wood. Silas stopped beside a patch of flattened sallow. Something passed here. Lenora crouched. The mud held no clear print. Only a shallow channel led between the leaves. Marlowe moved lower than that. Sometimes. Silas continued walking. Every mark looked important until examined. A tuft of pale fur snagged on blackberry thorns belonged to a deer. A scratch on a cedar was old. 2 round impressions beside the creek came from stones dislodged by water. Hope kept rising and collapsing. At the abandoned pump shed, Lenora found a partial track beneath the overhanging roof. Silas knelt beside it, 4 toes, a broad pad, no claw marks. His heart lifted so suddenly that it hurt. "Bobcat," he said. "Likely. Marlowe?" Lenora measured it with 2 fingers. "Could be." The print faced north, away from the slide. They followed the direction until the trail entered standing water. On the far side, mud had been washed smooth. Nothing continued. Silas remained there longer than necessary, staring at the blank ground. Lenora touched his arm. "We have a direction now. We have 1 footprint." They placed a camera beneath the pump shed and returned before dark. That evening, Della brought vegetable soup and took Wallace home. The cat resisted by extending all 4 legs against the doorframe. "You chose this," Silas reminded him. Wallace answered with a low complaint as Della carried him across the porch. "He'll be back," she said. "That sounds like a threat." "It is." The exchange made Silas smile, though the smile faded as soon as her taillights disappeared. He ate 2 spoonfuls of soup. Then he carried the bowl onto the porch. Rain had become a fine mist. The forest dripped in separate, delicate sounds instead of one endless roar. Silas sat beside Nora's empty chair. He tapped the rail twice. No ears turned in the darkness. For the next 6 days, he and Lenora searched every safe route leading from the ravine. They began at dawn. Silas marked locations on the map, while Lenora studied tracks, scat, disturbed moss, and scent posts. A park ranger named Owen Vale joined them on the 3rd day and helped check rocky ledges above the creek. They found signs of life everywhere. Elk had moved through a stand of young hemlock. Coyotes had followed the road at night. A black bear had torn bark from a stump before the storm. Marlowe remained absent. The trail cameras showed raccoons, deer, an owl landing so close to the lens that only feathers filled the frame, and Wallace crossing the creek path with no sensible reason for being there. Silas watched that clip twice. "You're worse at boundaries than she is," he told the frozen image. On the 7th morning, the camera beneath the pump shed captured a bobcat. Silas leaned toward Lenora's laptop. The animal appeared at 2:14 a.m., moving quickly through the edge of the frame. Only the hindquarters and short tail were visible before it disappeared into brush. Silas's pulse quickened. Lenora enlarged the image. The tail was dark-tipped. The size was close, but the left ear and right brow were hidden. "We cannot confirm it," she said. "It could be her." Yes. That single possibility carried him through another 2 days. Then Owen found the whisker. It lay caught in rough bark near the creek crossing, long and white with a worn end. Silas knew it could have belonged to any bobcat. He also knew Marlowe's right side whiskers had been frayed since the culvert. He held it across his palm while mist gathered on his knuckles. Lenora did not tell him to put it down. Silas placed the whisker inside the folded corner of the map. That night, he sat on the porch until the lantern burned low. The green mug cooled beside him. Water slipped from the gutter in slow drops, each one striking the stones below with patient regularity. He thought of Marlowe entering the culvert because she had been too tired to continue. He thought of the crate door closing. He thought of her slow blink beneath silver rain. Love, he realized, had not made him responsible for every danger in her life. It had only made him aware of how much of her life he could never protect. The understanding brought no peace. Near midnight, he tapped the rail twice. The darkness offered only rain. Marlowe returned on the 19th night after the slide. The rain had begun shortly before dusk, light at first, barely more than a fine whisper against the cedar roof. Silas sat on the porch with Nora's green mug cooling between his hands and the folded map resting on the table beside him. The worn white whisker remained tucked inside one corner. He had stopped carrying the map into the woods 3 days earlier. The ground was stable enough now for search crews, and every safe trail had been checked twice. Lenora still reviewed camera footage each morning. Owen continued watching the upper ridge during his rounds. No one said they were giving up. They had simply run out of places to look. Silas had begun learning the shape of that silence. It was different from the quiet after Nora's death. That grief had filled the house with memories. Marlowe's absence filled the forest with questions. A drop struck the porch rail. Then another. Silas lifted the mug and found the coffee cold. "You would think I'd learn," he murmured. A faint sound came from beyond the yard. Not a branch breaking, not the quick rustle of a raccoon beneath the steps. It was a low scrape, followed by stillness. Silas placed the mug down. The porch light reached only as far as the salae. Beyond it, the trees stood black and wet, their trunks fading into rain. He waited. Something moved near the alder. Silas's heart gave one hard beat. A shape emerged from the darkness, low to the ground and uneven in its stride. He stood before remembering not to. The shape stopped. 2 amber eyes caught the porch light. Silas gripped the back of the chair. Marlowe. She remained at the edge of the yard. Mud darkened her coat from belly to paws. Burrs clung along one flank. Her left ear, with its small V-shaped notch, turned toward his voice, while the others stayed aimed at the forest. For one terrible second, she seemed too thin, too small. Then she shifted her weight, and Silas saw that she was holding the right front paw slightly above the ground. The old injury, or a new one. He forced himself to sit. Marlowe watched every movement. Her sides rose and fell quickly. Rain had flattened the fur along her neck, making the healed scar above her right eye appear sharper than before. She had returned. The knowledge felt too large for his body. Silas wanted to cross the yard. He wanted to wrap the blue blanket around her and carry her into warmth. He wanted to undo every cold night he had imagined. Instead, he kept both hands on his knees. Marlowe took one step forward, then another. She stopped beside the stump and sniffed the air. Her mouth opened slightly as she tested the scents coming from the porch. Damp cedar, coffee, lantern oil, old wool, and the man who had waited there through 19 nights of rain. Silas did not speak again. A Steller's jay, confused by the porch light, fluttered down from the gutter and landed on the railing. It looked at Silas, looked at Marlowe, and seemed to decide the evening was too complicated. With one irritated call, it disappeared into the dark. Marlowe's gaze followed it. For the first time, something familiar returned to her face. The sharp attention, the quick widening of her pupils, the wild creature beneath the exhaustion. Silas almost laughed, but the sound caught in his throat. Marlowe moved toward the rain barrel. She paused where the runoff had carved a shallow channel through the mud. Her injured paw touched the ground, then lifted again. She stepped over the water and came beneath the outer edge of the porch roof. Not onto the boards, not close enough to reach, but nearer than she had ever stood before. Silas noticed a cedar cone floating in the rain barrel. She stared at it with the same grave disapproval she had shown at Lenora's enclosure. Silas felt his eyes burn. "You missed a great many cones," he whispered. Marlowe dipped her head to drink from a clean puddle gathered beside the stone path. She drank slowly, stopping every few laps to listen. Silas reached toward the table. Her body tightened. He froze. The phone lay beside the map, only inches from his hand. He needed to call Lenora, but any sudden sound might send Marlowe back into the forest. He waited until she lowered her head again. Then he moved one finger at a time. The phone slid silently into his palm. He sent Lenora 3 words. "She is here." The reply came less than a minute later. "Do not approach." Silas looked at Marlowe. "I know," he said softly. She raised her head. Water shone along her pale muzzle. One broken whisker on the right side ended shorter than the others. Silas's gaze dropped to the folded map. The whisker tucked inside it had not been proof. It had been a thread, something left behind while she found her way through ground that had changed beneath her. Marlowe took another step. The loose gravel beneath her paw shifted. She stumbled. Silas half rose. Marlowe flattened her ears and backed away. He sat immediately. "I'm sorry." For several breaths, she seemed ready to flee. Then rain strengthened beyond the roof, turning the yard into silver lines. Marlowe looked toward it. Her shoulders slowly lowered. She sat. The right paw remained tucked close to her chest. Silas gave 2 soft taps on the repaired rail. The sound was almost lost beneath the rain. Marlowe's left ear turned. He waited. Her eyes stayed open. Then very slowly, her lids lowered. Once, a tired, deliberate blink. Silas bowed his head. Relief moved through him without celebration. It was too gentle for that, too mixed with gratitude and fear. Lenora's truck arrived 20 minutes later with its headlights off for the final stretch. She walked from the drive, carrying a covered crate, moving so quietly that even the gravel barely spoke beneath her boots. Marlowe saw her at once. She rose, but did not run. Lenora stopped near the porch steps. "She chose this place," she whispered. Silas nodded. Together, they prepared the crate at a distance and placed water inside. No food, no pressure, no attempt to corner her. Marlowe watched. Rain streamed from the gutter. For nearly half an hour, nothing happened. Then she limped toward the darkened opening. At the threshold, she looked back at Silas. He kept his hand still. "You found your way," he said. Marlowe entered. Lenora lowered the gate gently. This time, there was no strike against the bars, only a soft shift beneath the canvas. Silas rested one hand against the outside of the crate, not where she could feel it, but close enough for him to know she was there. The porch light shone across the rain. The forest remained dark. For the first time in 19 nights, the darkness no longer felt empty. Lenora examined Marlowe before sunrise. The treatment room remained dim except for one shaded lamp over the table. Rain whispered against the metal roof, and the air smelled of wet canvas, cedar shavings, and antiseptic. Silas stood near the wall, with Nora's blue blanket folded over his arms. Marlowe had been lightly sedated. Even so, one ear twitched whenever Lenora touched the injured paw. Mud had packed between the pads, and a shallow cut crossed the outer edge, but the bones were sound. Her shoulder was strained again, likely from climbing over fallen timber or forcing herself through debris. "She is exhausted," Lenora said, "but she is not failing." Silas released a breath. "How long?" "A few weeks, if she rests." He looked at Marlowe's still body. The scar above her right eye seemed pale beneath the lamp. Her right side whiskers were shorter than before, their tips worn as though she had pushed through narrow places for days. "She will wake frightened," Lenora said. "We should move her before the sedative wears off." Together, they carried the covered crate along the damp service path. Dawn light turned every strand of wire silver. The forest enclosure looked almost as it had before Marlowe's release. The fallen log, cedar climbing limb, sheltered den box, and water pan beneath the platform. The blue blanket returned to the windward side of the stream. Silas hung it carefully, smoothing one stubborn corner. You know she does not care whether it is straight, Lenora said. I care. That is the problem with retired mechanics. The problem is poor fastening. Marlowe woke inside the den box and stayed there for the day. Silas heard only a faint shift of bedding, and once a low warning sound when Lenora checked the latch. He did not sit behind the screen. This time, he understood that his presence could wait. For 3 days, Marlowe ate only after dark. The trail camera showed her emerging slowly, placing little weight on the injured paw, then carrying each piece of food back into the den. On the 4th morning, Silas found the water pan filled with cedar needles. Lenora came up behind him. She did that herself, she said. I know. You look pleased. She is complaining. That may be the healthiest thing she has done. Silas removed the needles while Marlowe watched from the den opening. When he finished, she blinked once, then withdrew. The small routines returned. Silas sat behind the screen with the green mug. Instead of maintenance manuals, he carved replacement handles for Lenora's feed buckets, though the old ones still worked. Marlowe watched curls of wood fall from his knife. One shaving landed near the fence. She crept toward it, sniffed, and pinned it beneath one paw. Then she looked at Silas, as though accusing him of placing it there deliberately. You caught it, he said. Her ears tipped outward. Another morning, the Stellar's jay followed Silas from the parking area and landed atop the enclosure. Marlowe dropped into a hunting crouch so quickly that her sore paw slid forward. The jay hopped once and released a peanut through the mesh. It struck the platform beside Marlowe. She jumped backward and glared up at the bird. Silas covered his mouth. The jay flew off. Marlowe sniffed the peanut, rejected it, and pushed it into the water pan. Lenora later found Silas laughing quietly beside the screen. She is improving, he said. I gathered that. By the end of the 2nd week, Marlowe crossed the cedar limb without hesitation. Her gait remained careful, but the limp had softened. She groomed the healing paw each evening and began scent marking the log again, rubbing both cheeks against the bark. The stronger she became, the more restless she grew. At night, the camera showed her pacing the perimeter. She climbed to the highest platform and stared beyond the wire toward the ridge. Once, she spent nearly an hour beside the shift gate, testing the scene with one paw. Silas watched the footage in Lenora's kitchen. She remembers where it opens. She remembers everything important, Lenora said. He replayed the clip. Marlowe pressed her nose to the wire, drew in the forest scent, and returned to the gate. Silas felt the old fear rise. The slide had changed her territory. Another storm could come. A falling tree, a flooded creek, a vehicle on the road, every danger waited beyond the fence. Here she would be fed. Here her injuries could be treated. Here he would know where she was. The thought came gently, almost reasonably. That frightened him more than panic would have. What would happen if she stayed? He asked. Lenora closed the laptop. She would remain alive, she said. That is not the same as remaining herself. Silas looked toward the dark window. Rain moved across the glass in thin lines. She came back to the porch. Yes. She entered the crate. Yes. Maybe she wanted help. She did. Lenora's voice softened. Wanting help is not the same as choosing captivity. Silas knew that. He had known it when Marlowe first disappeared into the ferns. Yet love had changed shape during those 19 missing nights. It had become watchful, frightened, and tempted by locks. He thought of Nora's final months, when he had wanted to hold each hour still because he could not bear what time was taking. He had called that devotion. Some of it had been fear. Silas returned to the enclosure alone. Marlowe sat on the platform, facing the trees. Her notched ear turned when he settled behind the screen, but she did not look back. He placed the green mug beside his boot and gave 2 soft taps on the wood. Marlowe's head turned. Cyrus met her eyes briefly. "I will not make the forest smaller because I was afraid," he said. She watched him, unreadable and entirely wild. A drop fell from the roof mesh and landed on her nose. Marlowe blinked, shook her head once, and moved 3 inches to the left. Silas smiled. Rain strengthened over the cedars. Marlowe lowered herself onto the platform, her healing paw tucked beneath her chest. She did not retreat to the den. She stayed in the open while Silas sat beyond the wire. Neither mistook nearness for ownership. That was how healing began. Spring arrived slowly in the foothills. Snow lingered on the highest ridge long after the lower forest had turned green. New fern fronds rose beside the creek in tight, curled fists. Rain still came often, but it had lost winter's hard edge. It smelled of warming soil, alder bark, and the first salmonberry blossoms opening along the ditch. Marlowe was released again in early March. This time, Silas stood farther back. Lenora opened the crate near a sheltered ravine beyond the damaged section of the logging road. The slide had left scars across the hillside, but young grass was already pushing through the mud, and fallen trunks formed new cover above the creek. Marlowe stepped out without hesitation. Her right paw landed cleanly. She paused to scent the air, rubbed one cheek against a wet cedar sapling, and slipped beneath the salal. She did not look back. Silas felt the old ache, but it no longer seemed like abandonment. Her leaving was the proof that the careful weeks had succeeded. He returned to the cabin carrying the blue blanket folded beneath one arm. Wallace was waiting on the porch. The orange cat inspected Silas's empty hands, then walked inside as though disappointed by the lack of cargo. "She would have disliked you," Silas told him. Wallace jumped onto Nora's chair and began washing one paw. Silas had no evidence that Marlowe would have disliked Wallace. He suspected she would have considered him briefly and then returned to more important concerns. For 6 weeks, Marlowe did not visit. One trail camera captured her crossing a ridge nearly 2 miles away. Another showed only the dark tip of a bobtail disappearing behind a log. Lenora studied both images and said Marlowe looked healthy. He repaired the garden fence, cleaned the gutters, and replaced the cracked porch step Nora had complained about for 11 years. The old board came free with one pull. Silas stood looking at it. "All that discussion," he murmured, "and it was 4 nails." He saved the board beside the woodshed rather than burning it. In April, the Steller's jay began bringing a second bird to the porch. The newcomer was smaller and nervous, retreating whenever Silas opened the door. The older jay took both shares of peanuts. "You have not explained the arrangement honestly," Silas told it. The bird hid one peanut in the flower box and carried the others away. The second jay searched the rail afterward and found nothing. Silas added another handful. Small responsibilities had returned to his days without asking permission. He helped Lenora rebuild a damaged flight enclosure. He cleared branches from Della's upper pasture. He began driving into town on Wednesdays for breakfast at a diner where no one asked whether he was doing better. They simply refilled his coffee. Marlowe returned on the first warm rain of May. Silas was sanding the repaired porch rail when movement stirred beneath the salmonberry bushes. He set the sandpaper down. Marlowe stood beyond the yard. Her coat had changed with the season, less dense than in winter, the tawny color warmer against the green forest. The notch in her left ear remained sharp and familiar. But she was not alone. A small shape crouched behind her rear legs. Then another appeared beside a mossy root. Silas forgot to breathe. The 2 kittens were perhaps 8 weeks old enough to follow, but still round-faced and uncertain. Their coats were softer and paler than Marlowe's, marked with dark spots that broke their outlines among the wet leaves. One kitten remained pressed close to the ground. The other sat upright and stared at the porch with enormous amber eyes. Marlowe looked directly at Silas. He lowered himself into the chair. The movement sent both kittens scrambling beneath the salmonberry bush. Marlowe did not flee. She turned, touched her nose briefly to the leaves where they hid, then looked back toward the cabin. Silas placed his hands on his knees. Rain ticked against the new porch step. For several minutes, only Marlowe remained visible. Then one kitten's face appeared between two leaves. Its ears were small, the dark tufts barely formed. A bead of rain balanced on its pale nose. The kitten crossed its eyes, trying to study the drop, sneezed, and vanished backward into the brush. Silas pressed his lips together. The second kitten emerged near the old milk can, which had been returned to its place beside the steps. It stretched its neck toward the dull metal and saw its own reflection. The kitten raised one paw. Its reflection did the same. It jumped sideways into a clump of grass. Marlowe turned her head slowly toward the commotion. Her expression remained unreadable, but Silas imagined patience had limits even in the forest. The kitten crept back and struck the milk can once. The hollow sound sent both youngsters racing beneath the porch. Marlowe stayed where she was. Silas did not move to look beneath the boards. He could hear tiny paws shifting through dry leaves, and the faintest rustle beside the foundation. One kitten gave a soft, breathy chirp. The other answered from beneath the far step. Marlowe approached the porch. She stopped at the repaired rail, farther away than she had stood on the night of her return, but close enough for Silas to see rain darkening the fur along her spine. She sniffed the new step. Then she glanced toward him, as if noting that he had finally completed an overdue task. "You were not here for the complaints," Silas whispered. Marlowe's ears rotated toward his voice. The kittens emerged beneath the outermost step. They sat side by side in the narrow, dry strip under the porch, watching rain pour from the gutter. One lifted its paw toward the falling water, then pulled back before touching it. The bolder kitten leaned farther and received a splash directly across its face. It retreated, blinking rapidly. The quieter one sniffed its wet sibling and stepped away. Silas looked down at the green mug to hide his smile. Marlowe moved between the kittens and the open yard. She remained alert, scanning the driveway, the trees, and the roofline. Motherhood had not softened her wildness. It had sharpened it. Silas understood the gift was not that she trusted him with her young. She trusted the place enough to pass through it. That difference mattered. He gave 2 light taps on the rail. Marlowe's eyes narrowed in one slow blink. One kitten saw the movement and attempted its own version, closing only one eye before becoming distracted by a beetle crossing the step. The beetle disappeared into a crack. The kitten pressed its nose against the wood, puzzled. Rain softened around them. For 12 quiet minutes, the 2 small bobcats watched water fall from the same roof that had once sheltered only grief and an empty chair. Then Marlowe rose. She touched each kitten once with her nose and walked toward the ferns. The cautious kitten followed immediately. The bold one remained beneath the step, still studying the missing beetle. Marlowe stopped and looked back. The kitten hurried after her. 3 short tails vanished among the wet leaves. Silas stayed in the chair, listening until even the rustling had faded. He did not follow. He did not call them back. He simply rested one hand on the repaired rail and looked at the 2 small paw prints left on the new step, darkening the cedar where rain had touched them. By midsummer, Marlowe's visits had become part of the weather rather than part of the calendar. She did not appear every time it rained, and Silas never expected her to. Some storms passed with only the Steller's jays arguing beneath the eaves, and Wallace leaving muddy paw prints across the porch. Other evenings, Silas would look up from Nora's green mug and find 3 shapes resting beyond the rail. Marlowe always arrived first. The kittens followed several moments later, larger each time, their legs lengthening beneath coats that had lost some of their soft spring roundness. The bolder one usually came through the salmonberry bushes. The cautious one preferred the fallen log beside the woodshed, where it could remain above the wet grass and study the yard before descending. Names had helped Lenora keep medical records when Marlowe was injured. These 2 needed nothing from him except distance and a place where people behaved predictably. Still, he found himself thinking of them by their habits. The bolder kitten became the gutter inspector. The cautious one was the listener. He never spoke those names aloud. The gutter inspector had developed a determined fascination with the stream of rainwater pouring from the low corner of the roof. It would crouch beside the stones, strike at the falling water, leap away when splashed, and return as if convinced the next attempt would produce a different result. The listener preferred the outer porch post. It sat behind the weathered cedar, exposing only one eye and one ear while it watched Silas drink his coffee. One evening, Wallace discovered the visitors. The orange cat stepped through the open porch door, tail held high, and froze halfway across the boards. Marlowe stood beneath the alder. The 2 young bobcats sat beside the old milk can. For several seconds, no animal moved. Wallace's tail slowly doubled in size. Silas reached toward him without standing. "That road ends poorly," he whispered. Wallace backed up one careful step, then another. The gutter inspector leaned forward, curious. Wallace turned, entered the cabin, and jumped onto Nora's chair, with an expression suggesting the retreat had been entirely voluntary. Silas closed the screen door. "You inspected the situation," he told the cat. "Very professional." Wallace washed one shoulder and refused to look outside again. After that, Silas kept the door latched whenever Marlowe appeared. Wallace protested by sitting against the screen, but he no longer volunteered for closer contact. The kittens remained cautious too. They never climbed onto the porch while Silas was outside. They never approached his chair or investigated the green mug. If he stood too quickly, both vanished into the ferns. If a vehicle turned into the driveway, Marlowe gathered them with a low chirp and led them away before the tires reached the cabin. The porch was not a den. It was not a feeding place. It was a pause between forest paths. Silas guarded that distinction. He removed the bird peanuts before rainy evenings so the bobcats would not associate the rail with food. He stopped Della from leaving scraps near the woodshed. When a visiting delivery driver noticed Marlowe beneath the alder and reached for his phone, Silas quietly asked him not to follow her. "She comes because nothing here chases her," he explained. Silas knew pictures would have been easier proof than memory. Yet he had spent much of his life learning that important things did not become more real simply because they were captured. Lenora visited once a month to check the trail camera images. She sat at Silas's kitchen table with a mug of tea while Wallace occupied the chair beside her, like an assistant. The photographs showed Marlowe hunting along the creek, crossing the upper ridge, and moving her kittens between patches of dense cover. "They're learning well," Lenora said. Silas studied one image of the listener balancing on a fallen trunk while Marlowe watched from below. "They look thin. They look like young wild bobcats. Those can be the same thing." "They can. Not here." She enlarged another photograph. The kittens' coats appeared clean. Their bodies were lean but strong. Their eyes were bright. Worry had become one of the ways he loved. He was still learning that love did not make every worry accurate. The repaired porch rail weathered from pale gold to gray. The new step darkened beneath rain and collected three-toed bird tracks, Wallace's round prints, and sometimes the softer marks of young bobcat paws after Silas had gone inside. He never saw the kittens make those prints. The trail camera captured them visiting after midnight, when the porch light was off. They explored the bottom step, sniffed the chair legs, and investigated the metal milk can that had once frightened them. In one photograph, the gutter inspector had placed both front paws inside the empty can. In the next, only its hindquarters and short tail showed as it leaned farther in. The final image revealed the can lying on its side, and both kittens staring at it from a safe distance. Silas printed that photograph. He placed it in the kitchen beside an old picture of Nora standing in rain boots, holding a basket of mushrooms and laughing at something outside the frame. The two images did not compete. They belonged to different rooms of the same life. In late August, a warm storm moved over the foothills at sunset. The rain came straight down, soft and golden in the last light. Silas sat beneath the porch roof, with the blue blanket folded across the empty chair beside him. Marlowe rested near the salon. The kittens had nearly reached her height when seated. Their spots had darkened, and their movements carried more confidence. The gutter inspector no longer jumped when water struck its face. The listener no longer hid completely behind the porch post. Silas tapped the rail twice. Marlowe turned one notched ear. The kittens copied her, both heads angling toward the sound. Silas smiled into the green mug. No one moved closer. The cabin no longer felt sealed around his loneliness. But Marlowe had not filled Nora's place. The kittens had not become replacements for a family he had lost. They had simply widened the world beyond the porch. Rain moved across the roof in long, gentle waves. The gutter inspector settled beside its sibling. Marlowe remained upright, watching the tree line while her young rested. Silas pulled the blue blanket over Nora's empty chair to keep it dry. For a while, 4 living creatures shared the edge of the storm without asking anything from one another. Then Marlowe rose. The kittens followed her toward the ferns. The listener paused at the tree line and looked back once. Silas remained still. A moment later, all 3 disappeared. He lifted the green mug and listened to rain moving through the cedars, no longer wondering whether the porch was empty, simply because the wild had gone home. Autumn returned to the Olympic foothills with a week of patient rain. The salmonberry leaves yellowed along the ditch. Mushrooms rose beneath the hemlocks in pale shelves, and mist rested between the trees until nearly noon. Silas began each morning as he had for years, opening the kitchen window an inch, starting the dented percolator, and placing peanuts on the rail for the Stellar's jays. But the ritual no longer felt like an imitation of the life he had shared with Nora. It had become his own again. One evening in late October, he carried the green mug outside and found the porch already occupied by rain. Water tapped the repaired step, ran from the low gutter corner, and gathered in the stones below. The blue blanket lay folded across Nora's chair. Silas sat. For a long while, nothing moved beyond the porch light. The kittens had not appeared in almost a month. Lenora's cameras showed them ranging farther from Marlowe, each beginning the solitary life their kind required. The gutter inspector had crossed the upper creek alone. The listener had followed an elk trail toward the western ridge. Silas missed them. He was also proud of their absence. The thought would once have seemed impossible. A branch shifted near the salal. Marlowe stepped into view. Her summer coat had thickened along the neck and shoulders. The notch in her left ear remained visible, and the scar above her right eye had faded until it appeared only when the porch light struck from the side. She was alone. Silas lowered the mug to his knee. Marlowe crossed the wet grass without hurry. She paused beside the old milk can, sniffed its rim, and glanced toward the gutter, as though checking whether the troublesome stream still fell in the proper place. It did. A gust pushed the water sideways. Marlowe stepped back before it touched her and sat beneath the outer edge of the roof. "You learned," Silas said softly. Her ears angled toward him. The Stellar's jay arrived late, landed on the rail, and looked from Silas to Marlowe. Finding no peanuts, it gave one sharp complaint. Silas pointed toward the flower box. "You buried 3 there yesterday." The jay hopped down to search. Marlowe watched with bright, narrowed eyes, but did not crouch. The bird found 1 peanut, flew to the milk can, and struck it twice against the metal. The hollow knocking echoed under the roof. Marlowe turned her head slowly toward Silas, as if he were responsible for the disturbance. He smiled into the mug. "I've spoken to him." Rain thickened over the trees. For several minutes, they listened together. Silas thought of the first time he had seen her, behind the culvert debris, thin and silent, holding one paw against her chest. He remembered the crate gate closing, the cedar needles in the water pan, the slow blink beneath the enclosure roof. He remembered the night the mountain moved. Most clearly, he remembered 19 evenings when the porch light had reached an empty yard. Those nights had taught him something he had resisted since Nora's illness. Love could not be measured by how completely he prevented loss. It could not make a body remain, hold a hillside steady, or turn a wild path into a safe one. Love noticed. Love waited. When help was needed, it opened a way. When freedom returned, it stepped aside. Marlowe rose and approached the repaired porch post. She rubbed one cheek against the cedar, leaving her scent in a slow stroke. Then she moved to the other side and repeated the gesture, as balanced and particular as she had been in Lenora's enclosure. Silas gave 2 light taps on the rail. Marlowe stopped. Her amber eyes met his. Then her lids lowered in one calm, unhurried blink. Silas returned the gesture. When he opened his eyes, she was watching the rain again. No kitten emerged behind her. No crisis waited beneath the trees. There was no grand proof that she remembered every kindness or understood the place she held in his life. There was only a wild bobcat sitting beyond his reach, because on that wet evening she had chosen to be there. It was enough. A truck turned into the drive. Marlowe stood immediately. Della's headlights moved between the trees, and Wallace's orange face appeared in the passenger window. The cat saw Marlowe, flattened both ears, and sank below the dashboard. Silas heard Della laughing before she switched off the engine. Marlowe looked toward the ferns. Silas did not ask her to stay. She stepped into the rain, crossed the yard, and paused at the tree line. For an instant, her shape seemed divided between porch light and forest shadow. Then she disappeared. Della climbed the steps, carrying a covered dish. Was that her? Silas nodded. And the young ones? Gone their own ways. Della placed the dish on the cedar table. That sounds lonely. Silas looked toward the wet ferns where Marlowe had vanished. No, he said after a moment. It sounds right. No, he said after a moment. It sounds right. Wallace entered the cabin and claimed Nora's chair before anyone else could sit there. Della lifted the blue blanket and draped it over the cat, who accepted it as his due. Silas brought out another mug. They shared apple cake while rain moved over the roof. Della spoke about a fence that needed mending, Lenora's latest recovering owl, and the diner waitress who had begun saving Silas the corner table on Wednesdays. He listened. He answered. Once, he laughed loudly enough to startle Wallace awake. Later, after Della had driven home and the dishes were washed, Silas returned to the porch alone. The rain had softened to mist. 3 shapes moved along the distant ridge, Marlowe in front and 2 nearly grown bobcats passing separately through the ferns behind her. They did not come toward the cabin. They crossed an opening between the cedars and disappeared one by one into the dark. Silas rested his hand on the porch rail. At last, he understood. Marlowe had never refused to leave the wild. The creek, the ridge, the fallen timber, the hidden trails, and the dangers he could not remove were the shape of her life. She belonged to that freedom as completely as rain belonged to the valley. She had only made room within it for one Porch. And Silas, who had once believed staying meant never leaving, had learned that some bonds endure precisely because no door was closed around them. The cabin lights dimmed one window at a time. Beyond the porch, rain brushed the cedar needles and slipped from leaf to leaf. The repaired steps shone darkly beneath the eaves. Nora's green mug rested on the table, its pale chip catching the last thread of light, while the blue blanket waited over the back of the empty chair. Nothing there was truly empty anymore. It had learned another kind of fullness. The forest held Marlowe somewhere beyond sight. Perhaps she was moving along the creek bank, pausing beneath a hemlock, or listening while her grown young traveled separate ridges. Silas did not need to know the exact place. He had finally learned that love could remain present without keeping watch over every footstep. Inside, Wallace turned once beneath the blanket and settled with a small sigh. The gutter released one final stream of water onto the stones. Then the rain eased. For those who had stayed with Silas and Marlowe through storm, silence, loss, and return, there was comfort in remembering that not every farewell meant a bond had ended. Some creatures left because leaving was what made them whole. Some returned only for a moment, and sometimes a moment, freely given, carried enough warmth to last through many quiet nights. Thank you for remaining beside this porch until the light grew low. Wherever you were listening, may the room around you feel gentle now. May the animals you had loved, whether they slept near your feet, crossed your path once, or lived only at the edge of your world, rest kindly in your memory. And as you closed your eyes, imagine the last drops sliding from the cedar roof, the green mug cooling beside an empty chair, and one notched ear turning in the darkness before the forest became still. End of story.